Hello, my name is Dr. J. Michael Butler, and I am the Keenan Distinguished Professor of History at Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. At Flagler, I offer a variety of courses on 20th century U.S. history with an emphasis on the African American experience. And my area of research expertise, I suppose, is the civil rights movement with an emphasis on Florida's unique civil rights experience. So that's going to provide the foundation for our discussion today. Thank you, first and foremost, for joining me during this very unique experience. I've never given a public presentation through Zoom, so it's going to be a memorable experience for me from that perspective. But again, I thank you for taking time out of your schedules to join me for the presentations today. I would also like to thank Joshua Whitfield, the curator at the Amelia Island Museum of History, for inviting me to participate in the museum's programming. And I hope that this presentation adds to the educational mission of the museum and contributes a little something that maybe you didn't know about either Florida's history or the civil rights movement as a whole. So with no further ado, let's get started. I will share my screen with you so that you can see the presentation slides. I use the presentation slides as a template for where the lecture will progress, and hopefully that'll help keep us all focused, myself included, on the primary topic at hand. So I will share the screen and we will go to, there we go, the title page. As you can see, the program is co-sponsored by the Florida Humanities Council, and they continue to provide quality programming throughout this pandemic. So we appreciate their sponsorship of this program as well. But state, local, and national campaigns, the civil rights movement in Florida. One of the things that most interests me about Florida's civil rights movement is not just the perception of Florida and Florida's role in the national movement, but it's the relationship between campaigns at the state level, the local level in different communities, and how they have national consequences. You see that in a variety of different campaigns in more well-known places like Birmingham and Montgomery. But what about places that exist in Florida that maybe don't reach the national narrative? Now, when I say that there is a national civil rights narrative, we tend to think of it as Montgomery to Memphis, 1955 to 1968, the Montgomery bus boycott to the murder of Dr. King. That's an important timeline to consider when looking at the movement as a whole, but we have to understand that the movement began before the Montgomery bus boycott, and it continued long after the assassination of Dr. King. The Florida movement illuminates that to a really, really significant level. What I mean by that is Florida is a microcosm of the movement as a whole. We see trends and patterns that occurred in Florida that reflect the Southern movement and reflect on the national response to the Southern movement. In other words, we can learn a lot about the movement at a macro national level by looking at it through the prism of one state that seems outside of the Deep South narrative, and that is Florida. With that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. State, local, national campaigns, the civil rights movement in Florida, and how the movement in Florida unites each of those three topics. The outside perception of Florida is that this is the Sunshine State. I've heard from many people that, they weren't aware that Florida actually had a civil rights movement, that somehow Florida is outside of the movement mainstream, right? The outside perception is of citrus and beaches and Mickey Mouse and Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy, right? That for somehow Miami is different than Orlando, which is different from Jacksonville, which is very different from Pensacola. So how can we talk of a civil rights movement in such a diverse state? Well, it's a really, really good question. And it leads us to what we call in academia the Florida exceptionalism model. Now, what Florida exceptionalism means is that somehow Florida is outside of the national mainstream, and it's definitely outside of the Deep South model for understanding race relations, both before, during, and after the larger civil rights movement. Because of its focus on tourism, because of its multiple military bases, because of outside immigration, because of the number of people who live in Florida who weren't born in Florida, that we can't really identify a consistent civil rights narrative in Florida. That's Florida exceptionalism. We think of Florida mostly as Mickey Mouse and sun and sand, and not necessarily a place where we can learn about the nation's civil rights movement through an emphasis on this state as we would an emphasis on, say, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. My contention, though, and what I hope that this lecture reinforces, is that Florida should be at the center for how we remember the national civil rights movement. What we learn when we emphasize Florida and the continuing struggle for racial equality in this state is that a lot of the features and a lot of the tactics that were used in response to the civil rights movement in Florida became a model for the way most states dealt with their own racial issues. So instead of Florida being exceptional in terms of the way that it has experienced the Black freedom struggle, what we can understand is that Florida is actually a model of both the movement and responses to the movement on a national basis. So with that in mind, I would like to explain how. I give lectures often where I like to have a pretty set pattern of topics that answer what I call the so what question, right? So I can say that Florida should be at the center of how we remember and understand the nation's civil rights movement. So what? Why? How does that prove important? Well, I think there are four reasons, four primary topics that we can use to understand how Florida is at the center of race relations in this nation's history. First, the amount of violence, racially motivated violence, racially motivated violence that occurred in this state is a reflection of the racially motivated violence that existed in other Deep South states, and indeed the rest of the nation. We also see the boundaries of the chronology being pushed by this emphasis on racial violence in the state of Florida. Before we get to that, though, Florida exceptionalism, what does it look like, right? Here are a couple of postcards that were sold to tourists that undermine our idea of what Florida exceptionalism looked like, right? It's really interesting that idealized race relations or this idea of an old South model of idealized race relations was used in the state's tourist industry. Here we have the old slave market at St. Augustine, Florida, right? This idea of the slave market being a place to attract northern tourists to experience an exotic other, right? A bygone day with an elderly African American standing in front of it. Here we have a familiar, common really set of postcards where African Americans and Florida's exoticism, the Everglades, alligators, right? And a quote unquote darky's prayer, which puts objectification of Black Americans at a specific time in our country's history on full display. Florida is not exceptional in the way that African Americans are portrayed or the way that African Americans and the idealized image is used to either make fun of local residents or present local Blacks in a way that would attract more tourists to the state. So far from being outside of the regional narrative, the way that African Americans are portrayed, even within the tourist industry, indicates that Florida is not necessarily exceptional in the way that Blacks were used to draw outside interest. As I said, though, there are 4 reasons that Florida should be at the center of how we commemorate the nation's civil rights struggle and African American history writ large. And the first is violence. From the beginning of the century all the way through the end of the 20th century, racial violence is one of the most important elements of Florida's racial history. When we examine lynchings and we examine clearances and riots at the national perspective, we tend to look at places outside of Florida as the embodiment of racially motivated violence in America's history. For instance, lynching, right? Lynching is something that occurred when an individual was held responsible for a perceived violation of unwritten racial laws, or sometimes written racial laws, outside of the legal process. When an individual is held accountable for an alleged perceived crime by a group of people outside of the formal justice system, that, in essence, is a lynching. Lynchings are individualized acts of violence where a person or a small group of people are targeted for racially motivated violence and usually murdered. Not always, but most typically they're murdered. We tend to think of places like Mississippi and Georgia, Alabama, as places where lynchings really became part of local culture. Yet, what we tend to downplay is the fact that per capita, Florida led the nation in per capita lynchings between 1880 and 1920. This high watermark in American lynchings then, Florida led the nation in per capita lynchings. In other words, during that period between 1880 and 1920, it was more dangerous for an African American to live in Florida than to live in Mississippi. That's pretty shocking. Now, when we look at individualized violence, we often, as scholars, distinguish between lynchings, which is the individualized response to racial unrest, and clearances. They are called clearances because that's pretty much what they were intended to do. They were meant to clear the area of all Black residents for a variety of reasons. We see that in Florida, the clearances are all too common. And the clearances occurred when an entire community of the majority, the racial majority, wanted to target for whatever reason. Sometimes it's political, sometimes it's economic, and we have examples of each in the first 2 examples that I cite. But that the entire community is forced out, right? We see it in Ocoee, Florida, 1920, not too far from Orlando in Central Florida. The quote unquote Ocoee riot And riot implies that there was a sense of mutual responsibility. It wasn't a riot, it was a clearance that was precipitated by African Americans trying to exercise their right to vote in the 1920 election. As a result of this quote unquote affront, armed whites tried to rid the entire African American residential section of all potential Black voters. The Ocoee clearance in 1920 resulted in at least 56 Black deaths, probably more. Only recently, within the last decade, has the site of the Ocoee clearance been commemorated. And even that commemoration was one which was debated. And here's a photograph of that commemoration in honor of those who called Ocoee their home. And as a result of the 1920 political election, were forced out, often permanently. Another incident where we see a racially motivated clearance occurred in Rosewood, Florida, in the northwestern part of the state, before you get to in the Gulf of Mexico region. Rosewood occurred when a very common practice took place, and that was a white female accused a Black male of sexual assault. That's unfortunately all too common in the South, that some of these incidents of racial violence were precipitated by false claims of Black men sexually assaulting white women. There's a lot of speculation about why that accusation happened in Rosewood, but what we do know is that there was a lot of class-based jealousy that existed in Rosewood. In Rosewood, there is a relatively stable, self-sufficient, land-owning Black middle class that worked alongside poor whites who weren't as economically self-sufficient as African Americans. In this combustible situation in the 1920s, it only takes one incident to spark a racial episode. That's what we get in Rosewood. In Florida, African American men were not above being accused of what whites considered the most sacred violation of the racial status quo. It led to a clearance in which whites, armed with no legal restraints, forced African Americans permanently from land that they owned and communities that they had built, the details of which weren't known for over 50 more years. Clearances are one part of the violence that Black Floridians experienced, but so too were individualized lynchings. In 1934 in Marianna, Florida, Claude Neal was accused once again of sexually assaulting a young white girl and killing her. Again, lynchings say more about the community in which they occur than they do the guilt or innocence of the alleged perpetrator, right? Anytime lynchings surface in American history, I always ask students to look at what happened in that community prior to the act of racial violence, because that tells you a lot. It tells you a lot about the social, tells you sometimes about the political and the economic, but it definitely tells you about the cultural unrest that exists in a community that leads to these episodes of racial violence taking place. The violence was meant to restore order from the white perspective. Society is, prior to these clearances or lynchings, out of whack. Scholars call it the organic society, right? In which society is organized in a proper formal way. And if anything is out of whack, society collapses. Lynchings and racial violence, including the spectacle lynching of Claude Neal, was meant to restore communal order in a place like Marianna, Florida. Claude Neal, ritualistically executed, tortured, organized. So from the Claude Neal lynching, we learn the intricacies of how lynchings took place, how they were planned, how they were carried out, and how they were often ignored by communities in the aftermath of the racial violence. So again, Florida is not immune from the lynchings, from some of the most disturbing acts of community vengeance that you'll ever read about. Groveland, Florida. Many people who are interested in the topic of civil rights in Florida were first made interested in the topic by a book by Gilbert King titled The Devil in the Grove, relatively recently, within the past 10 years or so. And it emphasized the role of Groveland, Thurgood Marshall, and its sheriff in perpetuating many of the same themes in Florida that occurred throughout the rest of the South. And I totally agree with that. With Groveland, you see a false rape claim. Again, you see 4 young African American men, again, who are blamed for this alleged rape. You see the power of a sheriff in a Southern community to act as judge, jury, and executioner on a community's behalf, sometimes for economic reasons, right? Groveland was called Florida's Little Scottsboro. And in Scottsboro, Alabama in the 1920s, there was another similar incident that we tend to associate with communities in Alabama during the 1920s, during the Jim Crow South, right? But not necessarily Florida. In Florida, we have all of the makings in 1948 of a little Scottsboro. We have a sheriff who acted with impunity in enforcing local customs for a variety of reasons that would be fitting a sheriff in small town Mississippi at the same time. Willis McCall took it upon himself to hunt down those who were accused of the alleged sexual assault in 1948. Because of his activities, 2 of those accused of the crime were killed. Ernest Thomas, as the result of a mob that McCall put together to find and bring him to justice, and Samuel Shepard, who, according to McCall, on the night of a transport from prison to jail, tried to overwhelm him when he had to pull over at the side of the road. Here's the infamous picture of McCall in the aftermath of the shooting. He shot 2 of the individuals. Sam Shepard died. The other faked his death and later said that they were executed by McCall. Again, this is a scene that's straight out of Mississippi Burning, but it happened in Florida, which demonstrates that for a variety of reasons, violence was the most important characteristic of the racial status quo at this time. If you wanted to learn more about the inequities of the justice system, you could look at the Groveland case. Walter Irvin and Charles Greenlee are not pardoned for over a decade after they're convicted of the rape of Norma Paget. So Groveland provides another episode which reflects the racial status quo that existed not only in the state, in the Deep South, but in the nation as a whole. Harry T. Moore, we can keep going. 1951, America's first civil rights martyr, as he was called, right? A member of the NAACP, who later started his own organization, a voters league in Florida, where the vote and registration was emphasized. On Christmas of 1951, Harry and his wife, Harry T. Moore, were both assassinated by white supremacists whose political activities cut this part. Christmas night of 1951, Harry T. Moore and his wife Harriet were assassinated by supposed Klansmen because the political activities that the Florida Voters League really initiated threatened their entire way of life. Harry T. Moore became the first NAACP official to be assassinated during the Civil Rights Movement. If you wanted to look at the sit-in movement and how the student phase of the Civil Rights Movement began, look no further than Jacksonville, Florida, 1960, Axe Handle Saturday, August 27, 1960. This photograph is one of the only ones that came from that episode. Nonviolent campaigns, young African Americans who integrate establishments where they could not sit and be served equally with whites to prepare for the next wave of nonviolent demonstrations that were occurring in downtown Jacksonville. Klan members, other white supremacists, including allegedly some police, passed out baseball bats, chains, and axe handles to use violence against the young nonviolent protesters. Axe Handle Saturday made national news, and it was a turning point, some argue, in Florida's racial history. National campaigns also targeted Florida. St. Augustine. St. Augustine's struggle is very, very interesting. And I think maybe more than any other, this is where you can see the local campaigns, the state's involvement, and national response all come together. You see, in St. Augustine, the movement picked up steam in early 1964. Not started, but it accelerated in 1964. At the same time that the Civil Rights Act was going through Congress. Now, the Civil Rights Act was something that Dr. King and his organization, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Civil Rights Act was something that he turned his attention to in the late spring, early summer of 1963 with the Birmingham campaign. With Birmingham, King learned that racial violence that comes from nonviolent demonstration often provoked a national outcry, which forced the federal government to intervene. That happened with John Kennedy. In response to what happened in Birmingham, the images of the fire hoses and police dogs, he promised to bring a Civil Rights Act to Congress. This would have ended Jim Crow with one signature. King believed instead of fighting a case-by-case, city-by-city struggle to obtain human equality, that the Civil Rights Act was a way to do that. St. Augustine invites SCLC into the city in 1963 for a variety of reasons. And in 1964, they come. Initially, Dr. King did not want St. Augustine and the violence that existed there. He called it the most racist city outside of Birmingham, Alabama, that he had ever visited, even more so, actually, than Birmingham, Alabama. He didn't want the racial violence there to undermine support for the Civil Rights Act. But what happened, which is very interesting, is that because of the violence that existed in St. Augustine, the city became an example of why the nation needed the Civil Rights Act. We have the photograph of Dr. King mobilizing African Americans in St. Johns County with this famous photograph. It's the only photograph of Dr. King actually on a street that is later named in his honor, which is an interesting local bit of history. And we have the infamous photograph of the swim-in at the Monson Motor Lodge. This photograph was on the cover of Washington newspapers when the vote was held on the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Senators looked at this as an example of why the Civil Rights Act had to pass, to ensure that racial violence, using acid to get African American young people out of a segregated swimming pool, that this type of activity could not continue to happen in the United States of America. Local campaign, the state's response, Ferris Bryant tried to stay out as long as possible, only really became interested in preventing racial violence in St. Augustine when the state patrol that was called in to help protect demonstrators are turned on by the white mobs, and you have a federal response with the Civil Rights Act. It's all really interesting how this works together, and Florida is ground zero for understanding the dynamic very clearly. But it doesn't stop in 1964. It continues in 1968 in Miami. 3 protesters are killed by Miami police as a result of the protest of the Republican National Convention, which was held in Miami that year, the convention that nominated Richard Nixon. Protests, demonstrations devolve into racially motivated violence. The National Guard had to be called out in the middle of the convention to stop the violence that was occurring not far from where the nomination was being given. It demonstrates that even after Jim Crow ends, even after the Voting Rights Act passed, that issues still remain concerning housing inequalities, concerning political marginalization. You can see from the pictures here, right? We want Black participation to increase in Republican affairs. The Republican image is damaged by racial prejudice. This is continued frustration with Black marginalization that came after these laws are passed. And we see it in Florida. Same thing in the Panhandle, 1975, a topic that I've researched extensively, and that is racial unrest in Pensacola, Florida. The racial unrest in Pensacola, Florida did not develop around the vote or social segregation. The unrest in Pensacola, which continues, that the movement continued past the 1960s, revolved around the presence of Confederate images in public high schools and police brutality. So the movement doesn't end. It changes, it shifts, and sometimes a white backlash accompanied the changing emphasis of the movement, as we saw in Pensacola, with the defense of Confederate imagery at Escambia High and the defense of law enforcement who shot and killed African Americans without consequence. Those are issues that still remain with us today. On a national level, Confederate imagery and police brutality are issues that we can better understand by looking at the civil rights history of Florida. So violence, but also the urban-rural divide is another reason that Florida's civil rights history is instructive at a national level. What we see is that the civil rights movement in Florida, as in the rest of the nation, was different in the way that it progressed in urban areas and in the way that it progressed in rural areas. In Florida, which was predominantly rural during the 1960s, we still see that the legacies of debt peonage, the legacies of the convict lease system, that separation control of economic endeavors when it comes to the citrus industry, right? What are the similarities and differences between the Florida citrus industry or the Florida turpentine industry when compared to the prevalence of cotton in places like Alabama and Mississippi? The movement worked differently there with the growth and suppression of labor unions, with the white resentment from the working class at any Black advance. Economic factors play a role in the development of the movement and how it took place. Now, when you look at the urban areas, what role does tourism play? St. Augustine, that was the reason that in 1963, the movement picked up steam as it did. What about college towns like Tallahassee or Gainesville? What about the development of service-based industries in places like Orlando? What about the space race? What about the military? What role does the federal government play on the development of the movement in urban and rural places? Where are their continuities? Where are their differences? We can learn a lot about the two different types of movements that occurred due to economic reasons by looking primarily at Florida. The political approach is also the third topic that I think is of extreme importance when looking at Florida's civil rights movement, because more than any other state, Florida utilized and perfected the state and county governments to avoid meaningful integration. When the political approach to segregation occurred, pause it right there, Josh. My dogs are howling. This is ridiculous. Guys. Sorry about that. When it comes to the political approach to obstructing the civil rights movement, Florida wrote the blueprint. The words to keep in mind when it comes to the political obstruction that the state threw at meaningful strategies for integration, we have to think about delay, stonewall, and tokenism as meaningful restrictions that were put in place to, if not stop integration efforts, to slow it to an absolute crawl and integrate only to the level that the law was satisfied. What do I mean by that? It demonstrates, and it's important because it shows that there is a clear difference between desegregation and integration. I think that's something that the nation is has had trouble coming to terms with, is just because we desegregate doesn't mean that we've achieved meaningful integration. We see that in a political forum within the state of Florida by design. Now, we can go all the way back to the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and we can look at the champion of Southern liberalism for their time when in racial affairs, Leroy Collins, to understand how Florida perfects this delay, stonewall, tokenism approach when it comes to obtaining meaningful integration. With the Brown v. Board of education decision, as monumental as it left two questions unanswered. One, enforcement, and two, timeline. When do school systems have to integrate, and what happens if they resist? Well, the answer to the first question actually came from the Attorney General of Florida. Richard Irvin asked for an indefinite timeline, and he received state funding, approximately $10,000 from Florida, to prepare the case that led to Brown 2. And what Irvin decided was the best strategy to use against meaningful integration was time. In Brown 2, Irvin was the person who authored the all deliberate speed approach. All deliberate speed. The response in Florida, which other school systems throughout the South adopted, was delay. Delay meaningful integration for as long as it takes to preserve white supremacy. Only integrate on a token level when the federal government threatened to intervene. And we see that with the pupil assignment law of 1956, right? I think this is one of the more nefarious and damaging counter arguments that massive resistance produced during the civil rights movement. And what I mean by that is that the state of Florida, with all deliberate speed now being the legal mandate for resisting integration throughout the South, what does that mean? In 1956, the Florida legislature gave county school boards the power to consider, quote, sociological, psychological, and other social scientific factors as will prevent socioeconomic class consciousness among pupils in determining school assignments. Now, if you listen carefully to what that said, it basically gave the school board blanket authority to consider, quote, the scholastic aptitude, intelligence, and mental energy or ability of each individual pupil when determining school assignment. It says nothing about race. Color, race, segregation, integration is left out, but it gave each county a set of guidelines which could allow it for any reason to deny pupil assignment to schools in which they were the racial minority. The result was tokenism. The result was it would take activities at the local level. It would take the parents of African-American children who were denied access to majority school assignments, where a white majority existed. It would take them filing suit to force re-examination of the pupil assignment law. It took the emphasis on maintaining segregated schools and gave it to the county. And the county used the rules that the state provided to delay integration until African-American parents filed suit through the court system. And then, even if they do get a positive response from the court systems, which they do, the school system only had to integrate to the lowest possible level to fulfill the desegregation order. What that means is that by 1961, Dade County is the only integrated school district in the entire state. Orchard Villa, the first to integrate, had whites leave the school in massive numbers. Eventually, that one school was entirely black. What then does it mean to have truly integrated schools when the counties are given a blank check to resist? That's a question that the nation as a whole is still dealing with now. And Florida wrote the blueprint. Look at Leroy Collins, the governor in Florida who was moderate in tone, but he defended legal segregation as law. He blamed the NAACP for forcing the issue on school integration. Collins is seen as a liberal by comparison to other Deep South governors at the time, other Deep South governors during the movement, because of what he said in a speech given in March 1960, his last year in office, where he said that he represented all people of Florida, whether that person is black or white, rich or poor, whether that person is influential or not influential. He's the first Southern governor to speak of the moral necessity to end segregation. But he didn't use the power of the office in a meaningful political way to work against segregation. Stonewall use the law and do little to change the law becomes the pattern that Florida creates for the continuation of meaningful segregation. It continues into the late 1960s. I mean, we can go through the list of Florida's governors and how they used, if not Collins' rhetoric, his model to prevent meaningful integration from occurring. Look, by 1968, the presidential election, Richard Nixon and an independent named George Wallace received 70.5% of the total vote. Nixon and Wallace in 1968 received 70.5% of the popular vote in Florida. That is one of the key elections in which political scientists say Florida goes from being primarily a Democratic state to primarily Republican. Finally, the fourth element that I think is important to understand when evaluating the Florida civil rights movement is the courage and the activism that occurred at the local levels. We can't forget that the civil rights movement is a movement that was created and continued by brave African Americans who demanded better, who demanded that the country live up to the promises it made to all citizens. You have Harry T. Moore and the Progressive Voters League. We have lawsuits that are filed to integrate schools. What we see in Florida is that it took both a top-down movement, the NAACP, federal court decisions, organizational activity, that there had to be a top-down movement, but there also had to be a grassroots movement, a bottom-up. Local people made the movement, not great men, not national organizations. People like Harry T. Moore, who, after he was kicked out of the NAACP, formed the Progressive Voters League of Florida and continued to work for voting rights, which led to his assassination. We have the NAACP, of course, that's playing a very important role, but mostly at the county level, right? We have the Miami NAACP in particular that's very, very active in fighting the Johns Committee. We have the Tallahassee bus boycotts, which started in Tallahassee long before the Montgomery bus boycott had even ended, with the Reverend C.K. Steele. And you see the cross that is burned on the property of Bethel Missionary, the church that he pastored. The Congress of Racial Equality, a national organization, held its first Southern Interracial Institute in Florida in 1959. We have sit-ins We have local protests, marches that brought attention to the issue of police brutality. We have grassroots, national, and local organizations that combine to bring change from a national level, a national perspective. We have educators. Mary McLeod Bethune. We have young people in Tallahassee, Florida A&M students, FAMU activists who bring racial change. We have organizations like the SCLC and Dr. King, Andrew Young, combined with Robert Haling, a local dentist who was the chairman of the NAACP Youth Council, right? We have all of these different activities that together combine to form a movement. It doesn't just happen at the national level. It doesn't just happen in states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. It also happens in places like Florida. So the importance. I like to end every lecture by answering the so what question, by giving students a list of 3 important, 4 important, 5 important takeaway points, right? Here, the importance is that Florida should be at the center of America's civil rights story because it possesses many features that exist throughout the nation, right? Florida should be at the center of America's civil rights story because it possesses many features that characterize the movement at the national level. 1, middle and upper class whites held the line against meaningful integration. Judges, politicians, college presidents, newspaper editors all form what historians call massive resistance to greater racial change. Second, tourism, economic development, perception often means more to local leaders than meaningful racial equality. Tourism, economic development, the perception of Florida, in other words, the continuation of the image of Florida exceptionalism often meant more to local leaders than true racial equality. I think that holds true in many other communities as well outside of Florida. But Florida absolutely mastered that approach. Finally, the Florida experience raises questions about the power imbalance that still characterizes our nation and how far we truly have to go as an integrated society. Many of the issues that are brought up in the Florida civil rights struggle continue to characterize race relations in America today. What we learn from studying the civil rights movement in Florida is that there is a very, very clear difference between desegregation and meaningful integration. And while we've achieved the former, we have yet to achieve the latter. With that in mind, I thank you for your time. I thank you for your attention, and I really appreciate you taking the time to go through in a macro approach a topic that is endlessly fascinating, and I hope you learned a little something about the state's long civil rights history. Thank you very much.